Have you ever judged someone without meaning to, just by how they looked? Not out of hate, just assumption. You saw their clothes, their seat on the bus, the way they spoke, and your mind filled in the blanks. But what if one day the very person you overlooked turned out to be the one who could save your life? This isn't a story about charity. It's not about a millionaire doing good. It's about a 17-year-old boy in duct-taped shoes who stood up when every adult stayed seated. And what he asked for in return didn't just change one man's heart, it changed an entire neighborhood. Because somewhere over the Atlantic Ocean, at 35,000 feet in the sky, a woman's life was hanging by a thread. And the only person who understood what was happening was sitting in economy class, seat 34B. Before we dive into this powerful story of unlikely heroes, missed opportunities, and second chances, here's what you'll discover. The life or death moment that made a boy choose compassion over his dream. The quiet prejudice that nearly cost a woman and her unborn child their lives. And the question that a teenage boy asked, which brought a Wall Street millionaire to tears. So make sure you're comfortable, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the credits roll. Let me take you back to a cold, cloudless night over the Atlantic, where a boy named Elijah sat alone with nothing but his grandmother's voice in his head and a medical dream folded carefully in his back pocket. "You're going to knock their socks off, baby," she told him that morning. "They'll finally see what I've always seen in you." But what the world would see was so much bigger than any of them could have imagined. Elijah Williams sat in seat 34B, middle seat economy class, not because it was comfortable, not because he wanted to be there, but because it was all he could afford. He wore a hoodie that had faded from black to gray jeans with a patched knee and one boot held together by a strip of silver duct tape. The stewardess had smiled politely as he boarded, but her eyes had flickered just briefly to the state of his shoes. He noticed. He always noticed. Most people did. They just didn't say anything. Across the aisle, a toddler was bouncing in her seat, pointing at the window with delight. Her mother gave Elijah a soft smile, the kind adults give teenagers they feel sorry for. Behind him, a man was grumbling about not getting upgraded to business class. And up front in first-class champagne was already being poured. Elijah wasn't bitter, not exactly, but he was used to being invisible or worse, misunderstood. He knew the look people gave him. That quiet assessment, unpolished, underprepared, probably trouble. It happened in stores, on sidewalks, even at school. One teacher once called him a pleasant surprise in front of the whole class, meant as a compliment, but it stung more than it soothed. Because beneath the hoodie behind the worn sneakers, Elijah was brilliant. Not internet-famous brilliant, not top-of-the-class brilliant. Lived through too much, learned to survive, taught myself medicine, brilliant. He had memorized the warning signs of congestive heart failure before his 16th birthday. He knew how to adjust his grandmother's oxygen levels when the nurse line put him on hold. He had made flashcards about blood thinners, breathing therapies, and blood oxygen saturation. Not because it was a school project, but because it was life or death for someone he loved. Still, none of that showed from row 34, and if you had been a passenger on that plane, you probably would have passed him two eyes, searching for a real doctor. Someone with a white coat, or at least polished shoes. But here's the thing about assumptions. They're quiet. They slip in like background noise. And most of us don't realize we're making them until we're already wrong. Because in just a few hours, everyone on that plane, including a very powerful man in first class, would realize they had misjudged Elijah Williams. And it nearly cost them everything. Let me tell you what happened next. Because somewhere between New York and London, a woman's life began slipping away, and all eyes looked in the wrong direction. Until a quiet voice from the back of the plane said, "I think I know what's happening. Sometimes the person we least expect is the one we need the most. But we'll never know if we don't give them the chance to speak." It started with a whisper. "Richard, I can't breathe." Catherine Harrington had tried to brush it off. Just another ache, another flutter in her chest. Pregnancy came with all sorts of strange sensations after all. But now, mid-flight over the Atlantic Ocean, with cabin lights dimmed and most passengers fast asleep, something wasn't right. She sat in seat 3A, surrounded by luxury soft blankets, gourmet meals, noise-canceling headphones. But no amount of comfort could stop what was happening inside her body. Within seconds, the tension spread like a current through the front cabin. Richard dropped his tablet. His breath caught as he looked at his wife, her face pale, her breathing shallow, her hand clutched to her chest. "Somebody help!" he shouted, panic rising. A flight attendant rushed down the aisle. "Is there a doctor on board?" she called out, her voice strained, hopeful. No one answered. The other first-class passengers stirred, glanced up, then quickly looked away. Some fumbled for their phones. Others adjusted their seat positions, helpless, unsure. Catherine gasped again. Her lips were tinged blue now. She was 28 weeks pregnant and struggling to breathe. What Catherine didn't know, what no one around her could see, is that she was experiencing the onset of a pulmonary embolism. It happens when a blood clot travels to the lungs and blocks an artery. It's fast, it's silent, and it's deadly. For pregnant women, especially those on long flights, the risk is even higher. Long periods of sitting can slow blood flow, and the hormonal changes of pregnancy can thicken it. It's a dangerous combination. The early symptoms are easy to miss: slight leg pain, a little swelling, a bit of breathlessness. But then without warning, it escalates. And that's exactly what was happening. 35,000 feet in the air with no hospital in sight. The crew scrambled. The emergency kit was opened. Oxygen was offered. But Catherine pushed the mask away. "I can't," she gasped, panic flooding her voice. "It's not helping." In moments like this, time moves differently. It stretches. It swells. Every second feels like a minute. Every breath feels like a decision. And the people in first class, used to solving everything with a phone call or a card swipe, suddenly found themselves powerless. But 31 rows back in economy class, one person wasn't sleeping. Elijah Williams had been reviewing flashcards when he heard the commotion. At first it was just noise, a raised voice, footsteps. But then came the words, "She's pregnant. She can't breathe." And Elijah's body went still. He'd heard those exact words before, just last year, when his grandmother had collapsed in the kitchen. The diagnosis had been clear pulmonary embolism. He'd read about it obsessively ever since. He had to, because what saved her life back then was recognizing the symptoms early. And now on this plane, a woman with the same signs was slipping into the same danger. But Elijah hesitated. Who was he to speak up? He wasn't wearing a uniform. He didn't have a title. He was just a teenager in worn sneakers and a hand-me-down hoodie. Would they even listen? Sometimes the scariest part of doing the right thing isn't the risk. It's the fear that no one will believe you're the one to do it. But something inside Elijah wouldn't let him stay in his seat. He stood up, took a breath, and began walking toward the front of the plane. He didn't know yet how the crew or the husband would react. But he knew this: if he didn't speak, a woman and her unborn child might not survive. And so with a steady voice that surprised even him, he said, "I'm not a doctor, but I think I know what's happening. I'm not a doctor, but I think I know what's happening." The words hung in the cabin like condensation, visible, delicate, and easy to ignore. Elijah's voice wasn't loud. It didn't boom with authority, but it carried something that often gets lost in emergency: certainty without arrogance. A flight attendant turned halfway toward him, clipboard in hand. She looked at him, really looked for the first time, and then her eyes dropped to his hoodie, his shoes, his age. She blinked, hesitated, and turned back to the commotion in first class. "I'm sorry, young man," she said with forced calm. "We're asking for medical professionals. Please return to your seat." Elijah's heart thudded, not from embarrassment, but from urgency. They weren't going to listen. But something in him had shifted the moment he'd stood up. He couldn't sit back down, not when he recognized the signs so clearly. He raised his voice slightly, not shouting but firm. "Ma'am, I think it's a pulmonary embolism. Pregnancy increases the risk. If she's gasping and not responding to oxygen, that could be why. Does she have swelling in one leg, pain in her calf?" This time, the words caught the edge of the flight attendant's attention. She stopped walking. "What did you say?" Elijah stepped forward, holding her gaze. "My grandmother had one, same symptoms. I helped care for her. I've studied this. If it is a PE, she needs aspirin and to keep her legs elevated. There was no bragging in his tone, no performance, just quiet urgency, and experience far beyond his years. We don't talk enough about what it means to carry knowledge that no one expects you to have, especially when you don't look like the expert people are trained to look for. He was young, he was black, he was wearing duct tape shoes, and on that plane, all of that said passenger, not lifesaver. The attendant wavered. Then a voice from up front cried out again, "She's getting worse, please someone help." "That did it. Come with me," the flight attendant said sharply to Elijah, motioning him forward. "But if you're wrong, I pray I am," Elijah replied, following her down the aisle. When he entered first class, it felt like crossing into another world. The air smelled different. The lighting was warmer. Even the panic seemed polished somehow. Catherine Harrington was half reclined, her eyes wide and unfocused. Her lips had darkened. Her breathing came in short, rapid gasps. Richard knelt beside her, helpless. His usually confident voice trembled as he clutched her hand. He looked up as Elijah entered, then did a double take. Confusion, disbelief, and something else. Suspicion. "Who is this, Richard?" asked the flight attendant. "Where's the doctor?" "There is no doctor on board, sir," she said quietly. "But this young man may be able to help." Richard stared. "This kid," he asked, his voice hard. Elijah swallowed. He'd prepared for this moment his whole life, just never like this. "I think your wife has a pulmonary embolism," he said gently but clearly. "A blood clot in her lungs. She needs oxygen, yes, but also aspirin, and her legs should be raised." "Has she had swelling in one calf?" Richard's eyes narrowed. He looked at Elijah like someone trying to assess the credibility of a stranger in a job interview he never planned to conduct. But Catherine, between gasps, nodded faintly. "My left leg," she whispered. "Since yesterday." That was all Elijah needed. He turned to the crew. "We need to elevate her legs. Do you have aspirin?" "Some emergency kits include injectable blood thinners too, like heparin." The flight attendants sprang into action. The crew followed his instructions, not because of his status, but because he sounded like he knew what he was doing. And in truth, he did. Bias is loud until urgency drowns it out. In a crisis, truth doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes it comes with calloused hands and a notebook full of dreams. As Elijah worked, Richard stood nearby, silent now watching. He watched this stranger, check Catherine's pulse reposition, her legs whisper calming words. He listened as Elijah explained, "The aspirin helps prevent the clot from getting bigger. We'll need to get her to a hospital as soon as possible." And slowly, painfully, the weight of Richard's assumption sank in. He had almost lost everything because he hadn't wanted to believe that the help his wife needed could come from a kid who looked nothing like the man Richard imagined as qualified. By the time Catherine's breathing began to ease just slightly, the captain announced an emergency landing in Reykjavik, Iceland. And Richard Harrington, once too proud to accept help from someone like Elijah, could only manage two words. "Thank you." Elijah nodded but didn't smile. His attention was still on Catherine. "We're not out of the woods yet," he said softly, "but she's got a real chance now." The moment Elijah took charge, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. Not dramatically, not instantly, but slowly like a tide retreating. Flight attendants began following his directions. The oxygen mask was properly adjusted. Catherine's legs were elevated with a rolled blanket, and the aspirin, a single pill from the emergency kit, was placed gently in her palm. "Chew it," Elijah instructed softly, kneeling beside her seat. "Even if it tastes awful, it'll work faster that way." Catherine obeyed, her lips trembling. Richard stood nearby, pale and speechless, watching this boy, this stranger, command the space like he belonged in an ER. But Elijah didn't learn this in any classroom. He hadn't shadowed doctors in white coats. He hadn't attended seminars or been prepped by tutors. He learned it at a chipped wooden table in a one-bedroom apartment in Harlem, by watching his grandmother struggle to breathe, by reading her prescription labels and Googling medical terms after homework, by calling nurse hotlines and learning what questions to ask when insurance denied their appointments. When his grandmother Beatrice was diagnosed with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, he was only 13. And overnight, Elijah became a caregiver. He learned to listen for the rattle in her lungs, to spot the shift in her skin tone, To know when fatigue wasn't just old age, but the early signs of heart failure. He kept a notebook handwritten tracking every episode, every change, every reaction to each new medication. And over time, something strange happened. He began to understand her condition more intimately than the rotating doctors at the overbooked community clinic. So no, Elijah didn't have a degree, but he had something else: lived experience, sharpened into knowledge, refined through necessity. And at 35,000 feet in a pressurized tube with no doctors and a woman in crisis, that was enough. Still, doubt lingered in the corners of the cabin. The whispers hadn't stopped. Some passengers peeked over their seats. Some exchanged skeptical glances. A few even asked a flight attendant, "Are we sure he knows what he's doing?" But Elijah didn't waver, not because he felt confident, but because he had no choice. His hands moved with practiced care. He tracked Catherine's pulse, counted her breaths per minute, checked for signs of cyanosis, murmuring calming words between instructions. And as minutes passed, something almost imperceptible happened. Her breathing slowed. Not completely, but enough. Enough to keep hope alive. Richard, still shaken, finally asked the question that had been sitting heavy on his chest. "How do you know all this?" Elijah didn't look up. "My grandma," he said. "She's sick. I've been helping care for her since I was 13. Had to learn fast." There was a silence, and for the first time Richard didn't see a hoodie, didn't see a teenager, didn't see a kid who'd somehow wandered into first class. He saw what was always there: a healer. Not all intelligence comes from institutions. Some of it is born in necessity, shaped in quiet rooms, and tested in moments when no one's watching. An hour later, the captain's voice came through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been granted priority landing clearance in Reykjavik, Iceland. Medical personnel will be meeting us at the gate. Please remain seated." There was a collective breath of relief. Some passengers whispered prayers. Others finally unclenched their hands. And Elijah, he just sat back down quietly between two strangers who now looked at him very differently. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. But in his chest, his heart was thudding, not from fear, but from the weight of what came next. The wheels touched down in Reykjavik just after 3 a.m. Rain tapped lightly against the oval windows as the aircraft taxied to a quiet gate where a medical team was already waiting, white coats, gurney steady hands. Catherine was moved gently from the cabin, still conscious but weak. Her vitals had stabilized just enough thanks to Elijah's quick action. Richard followed close behind her stretcher. He didn't look back at the other passengers, but before disappearing into the jet bridge, he turned once, searching. His eyes found Elijah, still seated in economy, still quiet, still watching. They nodded at each other. Nothing was said, but something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken shift. Inside the hospital, the fluorescent lights were harsh. The smell of antiseptic hung in the air, and time slowed again. Elijah sat alone in a plastic chair in the corner of the waiting room. His hands were folded in his lap. His backpack rested by his feet, battered, soaked slightly from the Icelandic drizzle. His acceptance letter to the Young Medical Achievers International Program was still tucked inside, folded, safe, useless now. The clock on the wall blinked 4:10 a.m. That morning, just hours earlier, he had been preparing for a future he had dreamed of since he was 12. A full scholarship, access to world-class mentors, a chance to lift his grandmother out of that broken building in Harlem with the flickering hallway lights and the unreliable elevator. And now, that opportunity was gone. The program had been clear: interviews must be conducted in person. No exceptions. Elijah had read the line 3 times, memorized it, repeated it to himself like a mantra. And still he had chosen to stand up, to walk to the front of the plane, to help a stranger. He hadn't known the outcome. He hadn't expected gratitude, and he certainly hadn't calculated the cost. But in that moment when the woman couldn't breathe, he just knew he had to try. It's funny how life tests us. Not when we're ready, not when we're dressed for the part, but in moments when we are tired, unprepared, and carrying just enough faith to act anyway. That's what happened to Elijah at 35,000 feet. He had to choose between his dream and someone else's life, and he chose the life. A door opened softly, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Richard. His tie was gone. His shirt was wrinkled. He looked nothing like the polished millionaire Elijah had seen earlier that day. He walked over and sat beside the boy in silence. For a while they didn't speak, just two people once strangers, now sitting in the same fragile uncertainty. Then Richard broke the quiet. "She's stable," he said, voice hoarse. "The doctor said the aspirin probably saved her long enough to start treatment." Elijah let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That's good," he whispered. Richard looked at him for a long time. "Someone told me you were headed to London for a program." Elijah nodded. "Yeah, I was supposed to interview this morning." Richard checked his watch. "This morning as in about 2 hours from now." Another nod. There was a pause. "Is it reschedulable?" Richard asked. "No, sir," Elijah said softly. "One shot. You miss it. That's it." Richard leaned back in his chair, letting the weight of that settle. "And you still came forward," Elijah turned, finally meeting his eyes. "I didn't think about it like that. I just thought she was dying." Richard stared at him, this boy who, just hours ago, he had dismissed without a second thought. And now here he was, sitting beside the person who had quite literally changed the trajectory of his life. True character isn't revealed when we win. It's revealed when we're asked to give something up, and we say yes anyway. Elijah shrugged, trying to lighten the moment. "There'll be other chances," he said, though even he wasn't sure he believed it. And that's when Richard finally said what had been pressing on his conscience since they left the plane. "I misjudged you," he admitted. "I saw your clothes, your age, the way you looked, and I assumed you had nothing to offer." He shook his head, shame creeping into his voice. "And the truth is, you had more to give than anyone else on that plane." Elijah didn't respond right away. Then quietly he said, "I'm used to it, not with bitterness, just reality." And that truth hit Richard harder than any turbulence ever could. The morning light in Reykjavik was soft and pale, almost like it was tiptoeing across the horizon. Richard Harrington stood at the hospital window, watching the foreign sky grow brighter, but his thoughts were anything but light. Behind him, Catherine was resting. Machines hummed gently. Her breathing for now was steady. She would recover. The baby would be okay. That was what the doctor said. But Richard was still reeling from something else, something he hadn't expected. Himself. All his life, Richard had thought of himself as fair, generous even. He donated to children's hospitals. He funded clean water in Africa. He once gave a scholarship in his father's name to a small-town student he'd never met. He told himself that he cared. But what he realized that morning was more uncomfortable than any business failure or market downturn. He cared, but only within his comfort zone. He cared until someone challenged what he thought help should look like. Until someone like Elijah stood in front of him and shattered every subconscious filter he had spent decades building. When Elijah had entered the first-class cabin on that plane, Richard didn't just hesitate, he resisted. Not because Elijah was rude, not because he was incompetent, but because he didn't fit the image Richard had always associated with expertise. The truth burned quietly in Richard's chest. If Elijah had looked different, acted more polished, spoken with a certain kind of practiced confidence, would Richard have listened sooner? He didn't like the answer, but he knew it. And that realization, more than the emergency itself, was what shook him. He remembered something Elijah had said in the waiting room. "I'm used to it. Not bitter, not blaming, just resigned." That stung more than any accusation. Because Richard realized Elijah had been navigating a world that doubted him long before he ever stepped onto that plane. And Richard had been part of that world. Even if he didn't want to be, even if he hadn't meant to be. Sometimes prejudice isn't loud. It doesn't shout or wear banners. Sometimes it's quiet. It's the split-second judgment, the polite dismissal, the assumption that the smartest person in the room has a certain look, certain tone, certain pedigree. And Richard, he'd made that judgment and almost lost the woman he loved because of it. True self-awareness begins not when we admit what we know, but when we finally confront what we've refused to see. Later that afternoon, Catherine woke and asked about Elijah. "He's still here," Richard said. "Didn't leave. Said he wanted to make sure you were okay." She smiled faintly, then reached for his hand. "I want to thank him," she said softly. "But more than that, I want to understand him." And that's when Richard made a decision. Not just about gratitude, but about making things right. Because Elijah didn't just save Catherine, he opened a door Richard hadn't realized was locked. A door to a new kind of seeing, a new kind of listening, a new kind of responsibility. And as Richard left the hospital room that evening to find Elijah, he didn't carry a checkbook. He didn't prepare a grand speech. He just carried a quiet commitment. This time, I'm not just going to be thankful, I'm going to be different. They met again in the hospital cafe just after the sun dipped beneath the icy Icelandic skyline. The room was quiet, warmed by the scent of coffee and the soft hum of a vending machine. Elijah sat at a small table nursing a cup he hadn't touched. His notebook lay open beside him, half filled with diagrams, drug interactions, and a dream now slightly out of reach. Richard approached slowly, no longer the man in a custom suit with polished shoes. He looked like someone who hadn't slept well in days. But more than that, he looked like someone finally learning how to see. "Mind if I join you?" he asked gently. Elijah nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, just like they had in the waiting room. But this time, the weight between them wasn't uncertainty, it was understanding. "I owe you everything," Richard said, voice low. "And I'd like to offer something in return." Elijah looked up, cautious but kind. "Thank you, sir. But that's not necessary." "It is," Richard replied. "You gave up something important for my family. The program, the interview, maybe even your chance at a scholarship." Elijah shrugged, trying to keep it light. "There'll be other chances." But even he didn't sound convinced. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "My company has connections, admissions boards, medical schools, scholarships. If there's anything I can do, any door I can help open." He slid the card across the table. Elijah looked at it, then looked back at Richard. And then he said something that made the older man pause completely. "I appreciate that, sir. I really do. But I'd like to ask for something else first. Not for me, for my grandmother." Richard blinked. "Your grandmother?" "She's sick," Elijah explained. "COPD, congestive heart failure. Arthritis so bad some days she can't hold a spoon. She does everything she can to make sure I get opportunities. She even still sews clothes for neighbors to pay for my books. But her insurance barely covers the basics in the local clinic. It tries, but it's underfunded, overwhelmed. Doctors rotate out so fast she never sees the same face twice." He paused. "If you really want to help, sir, I'd like you to help her." Richard didn't answer right away. He hadn't expected this. He thought Elijah might ask for tuition or mentorship or even a job. But instead, here was a 17-year-old boy asking nothing for himself and everything for someone who had given him everything. Something in Richard cracked open, then quietly, painfully. Because in that moment, he realized what true selflessness looked like. Not the kind you write checks for, not the kind you list in end-of-year giving reports, but the kind that's born from love and dignity and the quiet belief that someone else matters more than your ambition. The most powerful requests don't come from pride or need. They come from love. And they remind us that humanity begins not with what we ask for, but with who we ask for. Richard leaned forward, his voice hushed. "She'll get the care she needs. I promise you that." But Elijah wasn't finished. "There's more," he added, hesitating. "If I'm being honest, it's not just about her. Our whole neighborhood struggles. People don't have cars to get to clinics. Some don't speak enough English to navigate the insurance paperwork. Others just give up because it's too complicated or too expensive or too humiliating to keep asking for help." He looked down, then back at Richard. "There's a clinic near us. It does its best. But it needs funding. Staff, transportation assistance, real resources. If you really want to help, don't just help my grandma. Help us." The room was silent again. Not because there was nothing to say, but because Richard Harrington, a man who had made a career out of calculated decisions and financial plans, had just been handed something that couldn't be measured in returns. A new way of seeing, a new kind of legacy. And it didn't come from a boardroom. It came from a kid who had grown up learning to heal because the system never showed up in time. Richard swallowed hard. "Okay," he said softly. "Let's talk about what that would look like. Let's build something together." Elijah's eyes widened just slightly. Together, Richard nodded. "Not a donation, not a one-time fix, a real partnership." You lead. I support. A long pause. Then Elijah smiled. A quiet, worn, hopeful smile. And for the first time, Richard realized this wasn't charity. This was equity. And it was long overdue. 2 weeks later, a sleek black Bentley rolled slowly through the narrow streets of Harlem. It was a Saturday morning, and the neighborhood was already alive, kids riding bikes, a woman selling tamales on the corner, and old men perched outside barber shops arguing over basketball like it was life or death. It wasn't the kind of place where millionaires visited often, and it definitely wasn't the kind of place where they showed up, with a homemade peach cobbler and a bouquet of flowers. But that morning, Richard Harrington wasn't here to impress anyone. He was here to listen, to learn, and to say thank you. Elijah met him at the front steps of a modest apartment building with peeling paint and a handwritten elevator out of order sign taped to the door. "Fifth floor," Elijah said, smiling apologetically. "Hope you're not afraid of stairs." Richard smiled, adjusting the gift baskets in his arms. "I think I'll survive." They climbed slowly, pausing every landing. And with each step, Richard saw what Elijah had grown up navigating every single day: limited mobility, aging infrastructure, and the quiet erosion of dignity that comes with being ignored by the systems meant to protect you. At the top, the apartment door swung open before they could knock. And there she was, Beatrice Williams, oxygen tubes in her nose, a cardigan buttoned up neatly, silver gray hair pinned back with care, and eyes that had seen more than most could bear. So she said, giving Richard a once-over, "You're the airplane man." Richard chuckled nervously. "Yes, ma'am. I brought cobbler." "You're forgiven," she replied, opening the door wider. "Come in, take your shoes off, and don't track anything across my clean floor." The apartment was small but spotless. A framed photo of a younger Elijah stood beside a worn Bible. The kitchen smelled like collard greens and cornbread, and in the corner a sewing machine sat ready-threaded, well-used. They gathered at a dining table that had clearly seen generations of meals, laughter, and hard conversations. And then they talked. Not about numbers or proposals, but about people. About the grandmother 2 floors down who couldn't get to her dialysis appointments. About the war veteran across the street with untreated PTSD. About the young mother who worked 2 jobs but couldn't afford her son's asthma medication. Beatrice told the stories. Elijah added the details. Richard wrote it all down. No assistants, no consultants. Just 3 people on different ends of the American experience trying to understand each other. That afternoon, they mapped out the beginning of something real. A community health initiative rooted in trust, built from lived experience, and led by voices that had too long been left out of the conversation. Transportation vouchers for the elderly, culturally competent medical staff, medication assistance programs, mental health services without stigma. All of it, not dreamed up in a boardroom but born right there in that small Harlem kitchen between spoonfuls of cobbler and the occasional cough from Beatrice's oxygen tank. Real solutions don't start with spreadsheets. They start with someone sitting down at your table and truly listening. As the sun began to set and Richard stood to leave, Beatrice reached out and placed a hand on his wrist. "I don't know what you're planning," she said softly, "but make sure it doesn't end with one meeting. We've had plenty of people promise things, then vanish." Richard nodded. "I'm not here to vanish, Mrs. Williams. I'm here to stay." And in that moment, he meant it. Not because it would earn him a headline, not because it would make up for past mistakes, but because he had finally realized it's not enough to write checks from above. Sometimes you have to sit down, roll up your sleeves, and start at the table. The idea wasn't born in a boardroom. There were no flip charts, no pitch decks, no catered lunch. It started in a Harlem apartment with an old sewing machine humming in the corner and a boy who had once given up his dream to save a life. What came next wasn't planned, but it was necessary. In the months that followed, Elijah worked side by side with Richard's team, not as a token voice, not as a story to be showcased, but as a partner. And slowly, brick by brick, they built what the neighborhood hadn't had in decades. A place where people could walk in not to beg for care, but to receive it with dignity. They called it the Harlem Community Health Initiative. But for those who walked through its doors, it became something much more than a clinic. It was where Miss Janice, age 82, could finally get her prescriptions filled without choosing between food and medicine. It was where Malik, a teenager with asthma, learned to manage his condition without fear. It was where Beatrice Williams met a pulmonologist who actually looked her in the eye when she spoke. No one wore lab coats unless necessary. Doctors introduced themselves by first name. And translators were always available not just for language, but for culture, for understanding, for humanity. Every element of the initiative had Elijah's fingerprints on it. Transportation shuttles for elderly patients, health education workshops in churches and community centers, partnerships with local schools to teach students about first aid and chronic illness prevention. Richard once described the work as unscalable, but Elijah smiled when he heard that. Maybe not scalable, he said, but replicable. If we listen the same way in every neighborhood we enter, and that's what made the model different. It wasn't about scaling a product, it was about scaling respect. At the grand opening of the Harlem Center, Elijah stood at the podium in a borrowed blazer and secondhand dress shoes. His voice shook a little, but not from fear, from conviction. This center wasn't supposed to exist, he said, looking out at the crowd. I wasn't supposed to be here either, not according to statistics. But the truth is, people like me have always been here. We've just never been asked to lead. There was a pause, then a standing ovation. Richard stood too, not from obligation, but from awe. He'd helped fund the building, but Elijah had built the soul. Not every solution needs to be revolutionary. Some just need to be rooted in the people, in the place, and in the promise that no one gets left behind. Months later, a second center opened in the Bronx, then Newark, and soon conversations began in other cities: Atlanta, Chicago, Oakland. Each time the model adapted, not copy-pasted, but community-grown, because Elijah insisted on one thing: if we're going to do this, it has to be with not just four. And through it all, every meeting, every milestone, there was one quiet, constant Beatrice. She never missed a meeting in Harlem. Her oxygen tank in tow, her gaze sharp, her voice steady. She didn't say much, but when she did, people listened, because they knew without her, none of this would have happened. The hospital room was filled with sunlight, not harsh but gentle, like a quiet blessing that had finally found its way through the glass. Catherine Harrington cradled her newborn daughter, swaddled in white cotton, her tiny fists curled into soft little question marks. She was perfect. 10 fingers, 10 toes, a strong cry that echoed down the hallway just an hour earlier. Now in the calm that always follows the storm of birth, Catherine whispered the name they had chosen, softly, reverently: Beatrice Elizabeth Harrington, named after two women who had changed her life before this child ever took her first breath. Beatrice Williams, who raised a boy with nothing but love, grit, and oxygen tubes, and Elizabeth Richards' late mother, who had taught him long ago what compassion looked like in the quiet moments, even if he'd forgotten for a while. Elijah stood nearby, holding a small stuffed bear. He looked like he didn't know where to put his hands or his gratitude. "You're sure?" he asked quietly, his voice shaking a little. Catherine nodded, smiling through tired eyes. "She carries their names," she said, looking from Elijah to Richard. "But we hope she carries your courage." Outside the room, Beatrice Williams waited in a wheelchair, her tank humming faintly. She wore her Sunday best floral dress, pearl earrings, hair neatly pinned. When they wheeled her in and she held the baby for the first time, something shifted in the room. Time slowed. Pain softened. History stood still just long enough for something new to begin. "She's got lungs," Beatrice joked, bouncing the baby gently. "Strong ones. She'll speak up when it matters." Everyone laughed, but their eyes were glassy, because they all knew what that meant now. Speaking up when no one believes you, when you have nothing to gain, when it might cost you everything. That kind of voice is rare, but it's how legacies begin. Months later, a photo would hang in the Harlem Community Health Initiative. It showed Beatrice in her wheelchair, holding baby Beatrice in one arm and Elijah's hand in the other. Beneath it, a plaque read, "We name our children after those who reminded us what it means to care for real." This place exists because one young man refused to stay silent, and one woman taught him how to breathe courage into the world. And so life continued. Elijah started his pre-med studies at Columbia University on a full scholarship funded by the Harrington Foundation. But more than that, he returned to the clinic each week, listening, translating, connecting. Not because he had to, because he understood what it meant to not be seen. And he never wanted anyone else to feel that invisible. Legacies aren't always built by power. Sometimes they're whispered into the world by grandmothers who never stopped believing and carried forward by children brave enough to stand up when it's easier to sit down. And perhaps that's the lesson that matters most. That one boy sitting quietly in seat 34B with a backpack full of flashcards and a heart full of purpose could help a stranger breathe again. And in doing so, remind the world that heroism has no uniform. Sometimes it just wears duct-taped shoes and carries a dream bigger than itself. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story of courage, connection, and community. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who believes in second chances and the people who make them possible. Because the next Elijah might already be sitting quietly near you, waiting for a moment, and a voice that says, I think I know what's happening.